March 15, 2009, Dannemora Correctional Facility. Mike Tyson had been clean for 3 years, no fights, no incidents. That's exactly why 400-pound gang leader Mountain Valdez chose that Tuesday morning to corner him in the chapel. "Your daughter screamed, didn't she, champ?" Valdez knew exactly what buttons to push. Exodus, the accident, the guilt that ate Mike alive every single night. 50 inmates watched as Tyson's hands started shaking. Not from fear. From rage he'd buried so deep it had fossilized into something else entirely. What happened in the next 90 seconds would rewrite every rule Dannemora had about conflict resolution. The warden held emergency meetings because of it. And for 15 years, when people talked about Mike Tyson's prison stint, they always came back to this moment. The morning Mountain made his mistake. The morning Mike Tyson proved some demons never sleep. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silence stretched like a taut wire about to snap. Mike's breathing came in measured beats, a rhythm he'd learned from meditation sessions with the prison chaplain, the same rhythm that once carried him through 12 championship rounds. But this wasn't Madison Square Garden, and the man standing 3 feet away wasn't wearing gloves. Mountain Valdez filled the chapel doorway like a human avalanche waiting to fall. At 400 pounds, he moved with the deliberate weight of someone who'd never had to throw the first punch. His reputation did the talking. His fists did the punctuation. "I said," Mountain's voice rumbled through the small space, "your little girl screamed when that treadmill cord got around her neck, didn't she?" The chapel's fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the folding chairs where other inmates sat frozen. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. Even the guards seemed to have evaporated into the walls. Mike's vision tunneled. The rage he'd spent 3 years burying clawed its way up his throat like acid. Exodus had been 4 years old. 4. And this animal was using her memory as a weapon. "You don't know what you're talking about," Mike said quietly, his voice carrying that familiar Brooklyn rasp that had once struck fear into heavyweight contenders worldwide. Mountain stepped closer. The floor creaked under his massive frame. "Oh, but I do, champ. See, word travels fast in here, especially about famous daddies who couldn't protect their babies." The other inmates watched like spectators at a car crash, horrified but unable to look away. Tony Slim Martinez sat in the front row, the 20-year-old kid Mike had been mentoring for 6 months, the kid who reminded him too much of his own youth, angry, lost, making all the wrong choices for what felt like the right reasons. Mountain's dead eyes shifted to Tony, and Mike's blood turned to ice. "Heard you got yourself a new pet project, Iron Mike." Young Tony there. Pretty boy like that? A lot of things can happen to pretty boys in maximum security. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a discharged gun. Mike understood perfectly. This wasn't random prison politics. This was personal. Mountain had done his homework, found Mike's pressure points, and now he was applying leverage with surgical precision. "What do you want?" Mike asked, though part of him already knew the answer would be unacceptable. Mountain's smile revealed teeth like broken tombstones. Simple transaction. "You step back from protecting the boy. Let nature take its course, and I don't share any more memories about your parenting skills." The chapel felt smaller now, as if the walls were closing in. Mike could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the familiar heat building in his chest, the same fire that had made him the most feared man in boxing, the same fire that had destroyed everything good in his life. 3 years of anger management, 3 years of meditation, 3 years of telling himself he was different now, better now, that the old Mike Tyson had died in that courtroom when the judge read his sentence. But Mountain Valdez had just dug up the corpse. "You got 10 seconds to decide, champ," Mountain said, pulling a sharpened piece of metal from his sleeve. Not quite a knife, but deadly enough. "Walk away from the boy, or I start cutting him into pieces so small they'll need dental records to identify what's left." Tony's eyes went wide. The kid finally understood what was happening, understood that he'd become a pawn in a game he never signed up to play. Mike looked at the makeshift weapon, then at Mountain's confident smirk, then at the 50 inmates who would witness whatever happened next. Some of them were Mountain's crew. thick-necked predators who'd been waiting for exactly this moment. Others were just trying to survive their sentences with minimal drama. But Tony was looking at him with something Mike hadn't seen in years: trust. The kid actually believed Mike would protect him, the same way Exodus had trusted Daddy to keep the monsters away. 5 seconds, champ. Mike's hands stopped shaking. The rage crystallized into something colder, more focused. He'd spent 3 years learning to control his demons, but he'd never actually killed them. And right now, staring into Mountain Valdez's soulless eyes, he realized he didn't want to. Some situations called for meditation and conflict resolution. Others called for Iron Mike Tyson. "Time's up," Mountain said, raising the blade. Mike took a step forward instead of back. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet certainty of a man who'd made peace with violence. "You want to dance, Mountain? Let's dance. But we do this right. No weapons, no crew. Just you and me, and we settle this like men." Mountain's smile widened. "Gladly, champ. Been waiting 20 years for this conversation. 20 years. The number hit Mike like a sledgehammer. This wasn't random at all. This was revenge. The number hung in the stale chapel air like incense from a funeral mass. 20 years. Mike's mind raced backward through decades of violence, searching for the connection he'd missed. How many faces had he broken in underground fights before his professional career took off? How many desperate men had climbed into makeshift rings for quick cash, never knowing they were stepping into the cage with a future world champion? Mountain lowered the blade but kept it visible, savoring the moment of recognition dawning across Mike's weathered face. "Starting to remember, aren't you, champ?" The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps. Mike's mouth went dry as fragments of memory began assembling themselves into a picture he didn't want to see. Detroit, 1984. A warehouse fight that paid $5,000 to the winner. More money than he'd ever seen at 17 years old. His opponent had been a thick-set Mexican kid, maybe 25, with sad eyes and calloused hands that spoke of honest work before desperation drove him into the underground circuit. "Carlos," Mike whispered, the name emerging from some locked vault in his memory. "Your brother was Carlos Valdez." Mountain's smile turned triumphant. Carlos Miguel Valdez, 26 years old, father of 3, worked construction during the day, trained at night in some rat-hole gym in Mexican town, fought under the name El Martillo, the Hammer. The chapel walls seemed to close in further. Mike remembered now. Carlos had been tough, experienced, fighting with the desperation of a man who needed every dollar. But Mike had been something else entirely. A teenage wrecking ball with dynamite in his fists and no understanding of restraint. "The fight should have been stopped," Mike said quietly, more to himself than to Mountain. After the second knockdown, it should have been stopped. But it wasn't. Mountain's voice carried 20 years of accumulated rage because stopping fights was bad for betting. "And you kept hitting him even after he went down the 3rd time." Mike closed his eyes. He could still hear it, the wet thud of his gloves connecting with an unconscious man's skull. Could still see Carlos's wife in the emergency room 3 days later, holding his hand while the machines kept him breathing. The doctors had used words like catastrophic brain trauma and irreversible damage. Carlos had lingered for 2 weeks before his family made the decision to let him go. "I was 17, Mike said, opening his eyes to meet Mountain's stare. "I didn't know—" "You knew enough to cash your check and disappear." Mountain's massive frame shifted, muscles tensing like a predator preparing to strike. "While my brother's kids grew up without a father, while his wife worked 3 jobs to pay off medical bills, while I spent every day of the last 20 years tracking down the Iron Mike, who killed my family." Tony sat frozen in the front row, his young face pale with the understanding that he'd become collateral damage in a war that started before he was born. The other inmates watched in tense silence, sensing the electricity building in the air, like the moments before a thunderstorm breaks. Mike felt the familiar weight settling on his shoulders, the crushing gravity of consequences he'd never fully reckoned with. In all his years of therapy, all his attempts at redemption, he'd somehow managed to avoid thinking about the men he'd hurt before fame and fortune made violence acceptable. Sanctioned, profitable. "Your brother was a good fighter," Mike said, and meant it. "He had heart, he had family. Mountain's knuckles cracked like breaking bones as he flexed his hands. 3 little kids who asked me every day when Daddy was coming home from the hospital. Want to know what I told them? Mike said nothing. There was nothing to say. I told them Daddy was fighting angels in heaven, that he'd won so many fights down here that God needed him to protect the good souls up there. Mountain's voice cracked slightly, revealing the human pain beneath all that rage. You know what the truth was? The truth was their daddy got beaten to death by a teenager for $5,000 and a reputation. The chapel's crucifix caught the fluorescent light, casting long shadows across the folding chairs where 50 inmates waited for violence to erupt. Mike could smell fear sweat and industrial disinfectant, could hear his own heartbeat hammering against his ribs. 20 years. This mountain of a man had spent 2 decades becoming dangerous enough to face Iron Mike Tyson in single combat. Had probably lifted weights while thinking about this moment. Had probably dreamed about revenge while Mike was earning millions in championship bouts. Tony's eyes met his across the charged air, and Mike saw something that twisted his guts into knots, the same trusting expression Exodus used to give him when he tucked her into bed. The absolute faith that Daddy would keep the monsters away. But Mike was the monster. He always had been. Mountain cracked his neck, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the small space. 20 years, champ. Time to pay what you owe. The chapel door burst open with a metallic shriek that cut through the tension like a blade through silk. Both Mike and Mountain turned toward the sound, their deadly standoff momentarily frozen as a corrections officer stepped into the charged atmosphere. Valdez! Officer Patterson's voice cracked with authority, though Mike could see the man's hand trembling slightly on his radio. Warden wants to see you. Now. Mountain's eyes never left Mike's face. Tell the warden I'm in a meeting. Wasn't a request. Patterson stepped aside as 2 more guards filled the doorway behind him, their hands resting on tasers. Move it! The massive man straightened slowly, deliberately, like a mountain deciding to relocate. But as he passed Mike, he leaned close enough that his whispered words were meant for only one set of ears. This ain't over, champ. I'll be back for you. And when I am... His gaze flicked meaningfully toward Tony. Make sure you got your affairs in order. Mountain lumbered toward the door, his crew of predators falling in behind him like jackals following a lion. The chapel felt suddenly cavernous in their absence, the fluorescent light somehow brighter, the air easier to breathe. Mike stood motionless until the last footstep faded down the corridor. Then his legs gave out, and he collapsed into the nearest folding chair like a demolished building finally surrendering to gravity. Mike? Tony's voice seemed to come from very far away. Mike, you okay? But Mike wasn't okay. His hands were shaking again, not with rage this time, but with something worse. Recognition. The past wasn't just catching up to him, it was swallowing him whole. Carlos Valdez. El Martillo. The man's face materialized in Mike's memory with perfect clarity now, as if 20 years of suppression had suddenly lifted like fog burning off in morning sunlight. Honest brown eyes, calloused hands that spoke of hard work and honest labor. A fighter who'd climbed into that Detroit warehouse ring not for glory or recognition, but to feed his family. Mike had killed him for $5,000 and bragging rights. The other inmates began filing out of the chapel, sensing that the immediate danger had passed, but wanting no part of whatever aftermath might follow. Soon it was just Mike and Tony in the fluorescent-lit space, surrounded by empty chairs and the weight of 20 years' worth of accumulated guilt. Who was Carlos? Tony asked quietly. Mike looked up sharply. What? You said a name. Carlos. Who was he? The question hung in the air like smoke. Mike studied Tony's young face, the same age Carlos's kids would be now. The same age Mike had been when he'd climbed into that warehouse ring with dynamite in his fists and no understanding of consequences. Someone I hurt, Mike said finally, a long time ago. But that wasn't the whole truth, and they both knew it. Mike reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a photograph, creased and worn from years of handling. Exodus at age 3, sitting on his shoulders at Coney Island, her tiny fists raised in mock boxing poses while she laughed at something just outside the camera's frame. I used to think my daughter died because of who I was, Mike said, his voice barely above a whisper. Because the violence in my life somehow infected everything around me. But I was wrong. Tony leaned forward. What do you mean? She died because of who I used to be. Because 20 years ago, I was a 17-year-old kid who thought strength meant never showing mercy, who thought winning meant destroying your opponent completely. Mike's thumb traced the edge of the photograph. Mountain didn't come here for me. He came here because he's been carrying this weight for 2 decades, just like I've been carrying mine. The chapel's silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the distant sounds of prison life. Clanging doors, shouted orders, the constant background hum of 800 men learning to live in cages. So what happens now? Tony asked. Mike folded the photograph carefully and put it back in his pocket. When he looked up, his eyes held a clarity that hadn't been there moments before. Now I stop running, he said. I've spent 3 years in this place trying to become someone different, telling myself that meditation and anger management could somehow erase what I'd done. But you can't build redemption on a foundation of denial. He stood up slowly, feeling every one of his 58 years in his joints and muscles. The old Mike Tyson would have already been planning his strategy for the inevitable fight with Mountain, would have been calculating angles and weaknesses, preparing for war. But the man standing in this chapel wasn't entirely the old Mike, and he wasn't entirely the reformed Mike either. He was something new, something harder to define. Mountain wants his fight, Mike said, more to himself than to Tony. 20 years he's been waiting for it. Maybe it's time I gave it to him. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like a countdown timer, marking the seconds until past and present finally collided. Tony's voice cut through the chapel's oppressive silence like a prayer desperate to reach heaven. You can't be serious. Mike didn't answer immediately. He was staring at the crucifix mounted above the makeshift altar, its chrome surface reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights in fractured patterns across the cement walls. 3 years of mandatory chapel attendance, and he'd never really looked at it before. Now he couldn't look away. Mike, listen to me. Tony stood up, his 20-year-old frame dwarfed by the empty space around them. This is exactly what Mountain wants. You give him that fight, you're playing his game. But Mike was already walking toward the door, his movements mechanical, almost sleepwalking. The photograph in his pocket seemed to burn against his chest. Exodus laughing, trusting Daddy to keep her safe from monsters she didn't even know existed. Where you going? Tony called after him. To think. The corridor outside the chapel stretched endlessly in both directions, a concrete artery pumping the lifeblood of 800 caged men through Indiana's maximum security maze. Mike turned left toward the library, muscle memory guiding his feet while his mind churned through scenarios, each one ending in blood. He passed clusters of inmates who fell silent at his approach. Not the respectful quiet he'd grown accustomed to over 3 years of model behavior, but something else, something that made his skin crawl. They were looking at him differently now, studying him like a specimen under glass, waiting to see how the legendary Iron Mike Tyson would handle being hunted. Word traveled fast in prison, faster than gossip, faster than contraband, faster than hope died in new inmates' eyes. By now, every man in this place knew that Mountain Valdez had marked Mike for death. The only question was whether the former champion would run or fight. The library door stood propped open with a thick medical textbook, its pages yellow with age. Mike slipped inside, grateful for the relative sanctuary of books and silence. Mrs. Chen, the elderly librarian, looked up from her desk with concern creasing her weathered features. Mr. Tyson? You look... I'm fine, he said quickly, then caught himself. 3 years of therapy had taught him better than reflexive denial. Actually, no, I'm not fine, but I will be. She nodded as if that made perfect sense and returned to her cataloging. Mike found his usual corner table buried deep in the stacks, surrounded by walls of books that had become his refuge since arriving at this place. Philosophy, psychology, biography, the accumulated wisdom of minds greater than his own, all failing to provide answers for the question eating him alive. He pulled out a yellow legal pad and tried to write. Not his usual journal entries about anger management and emotional regulation, but something else. A letter, maybe. An explanation. But to whom? Dear Carlos, he started. then crumpled the page. Deer Mountain, he tried next. The words died before reaching paper. His pen hovered over the blank yellow lines, trembling slightly. Through the library's institutional windows, he could see the exercise yard where hundreds of inmates moved in careful patterns designed to avoid conflict. Where was Mountain now? Planning, recruiting allies, sharpening weapons? The smart play was to request protective custody, solitary confinement until his sentence was complete. 2 more years of concrete walls and silence, but 2 years of breathing. Tony would have to fend for himself, but the kid was tough. Street smart, he'd find other allies. Mike's pen started moving almost without conscious direction. I killed your brother 20 years ago. Not in that ring. That was just where his body stopped working. I killed him the moment I decided winning meant destroying another human being completely. I was 17 and angry and convinced that mercy was weakness. Your brother had kind eyes. Even when he was trying to knock my head off, there was something gentle in his face. He fought like a man who understood that violence was sometimes necessary but never celebrated it. I fought like an animal. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I need you to understand that Exodus, my daughter, she paid for my sins too. The violence followed me home 20 years later, and she died because I never learned the difference between strength and cruelty. If you want your fight, I'll give it to you, but leave Tony out of it. He's a good kid who made some bad choices. Like your brother, like me. He deserves a chance to be better than the men who came before him. Mike set down his pen and read the words again. They felt inadequate, like trying to bail out an ocean with a coffee cup. But they were true, and truth was all he had left. Mr. Tyson? Mrs. Chen's voice startled him. There's someone here to see you. He turned to find Officer Patterson standing between the stacks, his uniform crisp, but his expression troubled. Behind him lurked 2 inmates Mike didn't recognize, thick-necked men with dead eyes and crude tattoos marking them as Mountain's crew. Warden wants to see you, Patterson said, but his voice carried an odd inflection, almost apologetic. Mike folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his pocket next to Exodus's photograph. His attempt to stay safe had lasted exactly 43 minutes. As he stood to follow Patterson, he caught Mrs. Chen's worried expression and managed a reassuring smile. But they both knew reassurance was just another word for lying.